Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the basic layout for a dissertation, and that's the same at undergraduate and at master's level. I teach education, and I teach a master's degree in educational leadership and management, and the dissertation sections are actually still very similar to those at undergraduate level. They're just, of course, there's a more depth, and the sections are longer. So dissertations tend to be at undergraduate level around 10,000 words, master's level around 15,000 words. So generally speaking, you'll start with an abstract. Now people ask what's an abstract? What is an abstract? An abstract just pretty much basically summarizes, well, the way I do them is kind of summarize each chapter, including the conclusion and your recommendations. I would say for a 10,000 word, 15,000 word dissertation, it's around, the abstract's only about a page long and no longer. It shouldn't be like 2 or 3 pages for that kind of length. It really just summarizes very briefly each chapter and your recommendations. Okay, next then you have your contents page, and I won't go through all the different sections, because in the contents page you also have figures and diagrams and where they are. And next you'll have your introduction chapter, so that just introduces what your actual research is going to be on, what the main literature is in that area, but of course briefly. It might give some background to that research. It also will tell the reader what your maybe overall aims are of your research. So you might have, let's say, for example, 3 aims of your research, what you intend to achieve. You should go into detail on those within your introduction and actually revisit them later, but I'll come back to that. Okay, so that's your introduction chapter. Next you have your literature review. Now your literature review, the way I tend to teach it is, it may not just be one chapter, it could be one chapter with different sections depending on the length of it, or it may actually be a couple of chapters, but again it depends on the length of the dissertation and the literature you're covering. So what you're doing there in your literature review, and I've got another video on what is a literature review and what you should do, but you're going through the main literature, the arguments, are there any different sides to those arguments, any ideological underpinnings that go with that literature, one side versus another. Like I say, I've got another video on what makes a good literature review, but that's your literature review. So you establishing who the main theorists are within that area of research, what the arguments either side, and with a master's dissertation I might even expect you to see where the gaps are. I mean, where are the gaps in the literature, and why therefore are you doing what you are doing. Okay, so that's your literature review. Next is kind of like your methodology. Now your methodology will go through well, at master's level it might go through your epistemology, what your kind of ideology is, your underpinnings for doing the type of research you are doing. You might be looking at different research approaches, for example, interpretivism and positivism, and again I've got a video on that. But I'd only expect to see that at master's level, not at undergraduate level, although sometimes I do see it, but you wouldn't necessarily have to do things like epistemologies and ontology in your dissertation, and some of you would be very happy to know that is the case. But at master's level I'd expect you to touch on it. I'd expect you to then go into what kind of research methodology you're using. So are you using, for example, a case study? Are you doing a survey? Are you doing, I don't know, action research, which a lot of teachers, for example, do. So within the methodology also, I'll expect you to go through your research methods, what methods you're using, questionnaire, etc., advantages, disadvantages, literature, introduce literature on those methodologies, and also ethics section will be in with your methodology as well, which is really very important if you're doing empirical research. So after the methodology and you've told your reader what research methods you are using to meet your aims of your research, next what you have is actually the research analysis. So it might be the research results first and then the analysis. Okay, sometimes they can go together in a chapter because that makes sense, and then other times they might be separate chapters depending on the length again of your dissertation. And again, I'll go through in a later video what makes good research analysis. I mean, generally speaking, the better your what's called a conceptual framework, you're better on your analysis. So if you actually base in your analysis on a some kind of framework. But again, I'll come back to that. That's more likely to occur at master's level rather than undergraduate level as well. So after your research analysis and you've analysed all your research, then what you would have is your recommendations. So I'm going to run out of room here. Recommendations and conclusions. Now, depending on your type of dissertation, so it might be, for example, you are doing recommendations for something, maybe it's action research, and you're trying to find better ways to teach English, grammar, or better ways to teach maths at Key Stage 2, then your recommendations are from your research that you recommend whatever approach it might be to teaching, for example, and then you'll have a conclusion. Now, generally speaking, dissertations do have some type of recommendation, I suppose not all, but then you have a conclusion chapter as well. In the conclusion chapter, it's really utmost important that you revisit those aims, your initial aims, and say to what extent you actually met those aims throughout your research. And also within your recommendations conclusion, your conclusion chapter, you might also look at limitations to your research. Now, generally speaking, the limitations are very similar, especially for undergraduate and master's students who are doing it part-time. Usually it's things like time, not surprisingly, especially if you're, for example, in full-time job. And also things like maybe money would limit how big perhaps a survey is that you undertake, etc. Okay, and then of course after that you'll have your references and your appendices, which will go at the end as well. So that's pretty much basic structure to your dissertation, but each section, of course, you need to think about in a lot of detail. So good luck.